I joined in August 2010.
So 2010, but
Yeah.
But you were involved in sports and press operations before, weren't you?
I was, yeah. This would be my third Olympic Games that I was involved in. I worked in the Olympic Games in Athens and then the Winter Olympic Games in Turin. So.
But it all started, you know, off camera. Rozmari told me her story, how she got involved, and this started on a very was it a rainy day in Manchester, and so.
Right.
But how did it all happen? Because
it was in 1999, and at the time I was working for Sport England, which is the government organisation that funds and supports and develops sports in England. And it was a Friday night in Manchester. I was in the office very, very late, and I need to be honest and say I didn't normally work that late on a Friday night, but I was going out to dinner with some friends, so I stayed in the office. And on that particular evening, the chief executive of Sport England happened to be in the Manchester office, and he came to see me and asked me to help him with some IT issue that he was having. About half an hour later he came back and asked me if I was available to go and work abroad for 3 weeks on the following Wednesday, which I said yes straight away to. And I was then sent to work on the World University Games in 1999, which were held in Palma, Mallorca in Spain. And when I was there, my job was to observe a major sports event, because at that time the World University Games was the second largest sports event in the world, and Manchester was about to have the Commonwealth Games in Manchester in 2002. So my job was to write a report on the organisation of the event and what we could learn from that event. When I was there, I started to write the report, and after about 3 or 4 days I realised that I had a lot of spare time on my hands. So I went to see the chef de mission from the Great Britain squad for the games and said, is there anything that I can help with? And she immediately said, we really need some help in our press team, which consisted of one person. And I immediately said, well, I don't know anything about the press. I've never worked in the press previously. And she said, but you can learn and we will help, and we'd really welcome your support. So I went to work in the press office with the press manager there, and learnt an enormous amount about the workings of the press and how the media were supported.
Rozmari is a diamond in the rough, so to speak, because she's been involved in press operations for more than a decade now, right? So this means that she has her hands-on experience, and actually you are also developing or developed a special set of guidelines for press operations, didn't you?
Yeah, when I arrived in London, my role very much was to support the provision of staffing for the press operations. So that involved appointing 470 paid workforce.
So actually 470 people were hired by the press operations function.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and 3,500 volunteers. So a huge
3,500 volunteers.
Yeah, huge number. Because press operations works at every single competition venue and in the main press centre, so it's a lot of support that's required. And my role was to appoint those people, but more importantly, and the emphasis of my work was to provide the training that they needed in order to do their role. To do a significant and a great role with the world's media. I think one of the first things I would point out is that London 2012 spent an enormous amount of time ensuring that they got the correct volunteers. We had over 250,000 applicants. We put out the the call right across the nation. It was a national advertising campaign, and we had 250,000 applicants for 70,000 actual places. We sifted through all of the applications. We interviewed around about 140,000, and 70,000 were then successful. So we were able to take the people who performed best at interview and who had the best background and the best experience in order to become involved in the games. So from my point of view, I would say that was the most important aspect, is ensuring that we got the right calibre, the right quality of volunteer in order to then develop them further.
The function of press operations, do you follow, how do you prepare for the race, let's say, of in a particular sport?
Okay, well, I think the first thing we do is provide a high level of information to the world's media. And that, when I say media, I'm talking really broadcast journalists, written press journalists, and photographers. Photographers are a very important group within our area. And basically we would provide them with background information on all of the athletes, so biographical information, previous event success, etc. We would then give them details of exactly who is taking part in this particular event, and then our main role then is, as soon as literally the minute the event is finished, whoever crosses the line first or hits the target, etc., we would produce that information on in London it was called Info Plus, and journalists could access that. Now, if a journalist wasn't able to access the Info Plus system, didn't have computer access, IT access, then they were able to pick up this information in a paper format. We would like to think that we were moving forward and it was a paperless operation, but unfortunately journalists, they still like to have their hands on.
That's very important information, for the Russian side, because again, how old are journalists on average? What's the age?
I think I would probably say the majority of the journalists that we came across were kind of 40 plus. Okay. Yeah. They do use the IT, they do use the material that's available to them, but a lot of them like to have that tangible piece of paper in their hands that they can take away or drop into their story. So we would provide that level of information. We then, press operation then plays a very important role once people cross the line. The first people that an athlete needs to speak to at the end of their event is the press, and it's an IOC requirement, a regulation that athletes have to talk to they have to walk through an area called the mix zone. Mix zone, okay. Yeah, they don't actually have to speak, but it's very rare that anybody would walk through that area and not speak to the press. But there's a lot of other pressures on the athlete or on the organisers, because they may have to have a drug test, they may have to go to doping control. Yeah. A medal ceremony may be quite soon after the event finishes. It might be
it's not in the evening where everybody who won the medal participates.
No, that was in the summer. My experience of the Winter Olympics in
Torino.
In Torino, yeah. They didn't do medal presentations at the venues. Everybody came to a very beautiful plaza in the centre of Turin each evening, and they had medal presentations. I don't know what the situation is with Sochi. It might be that is the decision that's made there. But media want to get their story out very quickly, and as you can imagine, there are very many time zones that they may need to get their story across. So they're very demanding as a group of people, because their editors will be saying we need these stories straight away, and it's about.
So there are a lot of deadlines for them.
Huge amount of deadlines to get stories out. So in terms of getting athletes to them very quickly, that's the role of press operations. But other things like protocol, etc., take precedence. If they need to go to a medal presentation ceremony, or indeed if they need to go to doping control, then we have to allow that, and then we have to get them back to speak to the media, which can be quite problematic.
Did you have interpreters as part of your function, and how were they involved? Let's say, how did you bring in interpreters when and if needed?
Well, very very similar to the way you've just described that. There was a separate functional area within London 2012 called language services.
So that was separate, not part of the press operations.
It wasn't part of press operations,
okay.
But we worked. They were our best friends. We needed their help.
Okay.
They were significant in our provision of good service to the media. So we worked closely with our colleagues there, and we ensured that some of their volunteers came into our team. And when we knew, for example, if a Chinese athlete was predicted to be one of the medal winners, then we always ensured that we had a Chinese interpreter on site. A great example to give you is in the archery.
Archery.
Yeah, we needed Korean. We knew that the Koreans were the world's best archers, that they were likely to win the majority of the medals. So we absolutely needed to work closely with language services to ensure that we had the correct language, the correct interpreters available to us. If the interpreter had a knowledge of archery, we loved them. They were the best people. If they had a knowledge of the sport as well as the language. Absolutely, we need people who have done their research, that they want. Hopefully people will be allocated to the sports quite early, so they know where they will be based. And part of the training that we developed was to provide them with a huge amount of information on the sport, so that they could interpret some of the terms. For example, again, using archery, they're very unique to that sport, and you need to be fully aware of that and know the translations appropriately. So doing a lot of background research and concentrating on a specific sport. And again, part of the requirement of the IOC is that you have a significant level of information. I'm sure there are people currently working for Sochi 2014 who are preparing the information on the specific sports, and that information will then be available to translators, to the press, etc. The work on this would have started some time ago. Okay. Well, there were 4 strands of training for everybody. The first strand was
Are we talking volunteers or are we talking paid staff
We're talking
members?
for volunteers now. Yeah. The first strand or block of training was called orientation, and that was very much about anything generic that we wanted them to be fully aware of in terms of London 2012 and what was unique and what behaviours we expected, what level of service we anticipated, and everybody did that. And we trained high numbers at a time. We took over Wembley, which was one of the football venues that you're probably aware of, and we trained 10,000 people at a time. So we had seven different sessions for people there, and we brought in a lot of people to welcome them and to say this is how we want to go forward. The second strand of training is called functional area specific training. So that was very much about press operations and about what the needs were.
How much time was dedicated to each strand or stream of training?
The orientation was a 4-hour session.
4 hour.
Yeah, and then the functional area was a 6-hour session. So it was a little bit longer, a full day training basically. And they were also given a guide, some written material, and a DVD that they could replay again. So it's quite a detailed level of information. And then the third day was leadership. So basically, if you were in a leadership role, that you were managing people or supporting people, then you undertook a day of leadership training, again 4 hours. And then the final one was venue specific. So you went to the venue that you were working at, and you spent 2 to 4 hours there orientating yourself with the venue, different routes, different areas, that sort of thing. Okay, just a step before that, we weren't directly involved in the content of the opening ceremony. That was kept very, very secretive, and one of the things that everybody seemed to be very surprised about was that the details of the opening ceremony didn't get out into the public arena, but I think people were quite happy to have been told details, and they kept that very secret. So we didn't know too much about what was going to happen at the ceremony.
But despite the fact that there were some rehearsals and run-throughs.
There were five full rehearsals in the stadium, and the last two members of staff and volunteers were actually given dress rehearsal tickets. But I knew that I would be at the actual ceremony, so I gave my ticket to my sister.
So this means that you had a day off at the day of the ceremony. You didn't work, or
no,
did you?
I was working at the. I was at the ceremony but working.
All right.
So basically, they went to the rehearsal, but they wouldn't even tell me what had happened at the rehearsal. Everybody was very secretive about it. On the morning of the ceremony, I was based in the main press centre, and it was an incredibly busy place. Journalists had arrived maybe 2-3 days before. They were all working on their pre-game stories, etc. And the morning of the ceremony, there was a press conference in the main press centre that involved everybody, all the senior managers who'd put together the opening ceremony, and that was the first time that journalists had the opportunity to ask questions. They didn't tell them everything. They held quite a bit back, and then basically they were then asked to leave the main press centre. Everything was closed down around us, and security was incredibly tight. I went over to the stadium around about 4 o'clock that afternoon, and I was working in the press area. In the we have an area called the Tribunes, which is where the press sit, and our job was to manage that area and to hand out information. We had you might be interested in this. We had we didn't even know who was lighting the flame. We were told that when Zimbabwe came out, that we would be handed a piece of paper that we could then hand to journalists. So Zimbabwe came out, and then it was Team GB, and once they came out, we were able to hand out the information. So it was a very well organised, very secretive day. But it worked out very well, and I think it got huge plaudits as a.
When did you personally learn the information about who's going to light the flame?
At the same time as the journalists.
As the journalists,
yeah. Literally, I will be honest and say that I was handed the paper and I read it before I handed it out to the journalists.
But actually, but who printed out this version that you received?
Okay, it was printed out by the communications team. So the local communications team.
And then they passed this information on to the press operations function commentators.
So all the commentators, all the journalists, and even the photographers needed to have that information. So it literally we had a lot of people who literally ran with information and handed it out. So it was literally at that stage that we knew what the situation was. But as you can imagine, that whole evening was incredibly high. There's a lot of pressure. The media were absolutely desperate to get that information, to be the first person to break that story.
And actually, was this information translated into what languages? Actually, was it translated into?
It was English and French.
Only two languages.
But through the media centres, a journalist could get they could get whatever language they needed it in. Actually.
Tell us about this experience, which is quite funny, I found.
I've been a Manchester. My father was a Manchester United fan, and consequently, I became a big Manchester United fan. And I've lived in Manchester before I came to London. I've always lived in Manchester, and used to go to watch Manchester United play regularly. So David Beckham was my favourite player always, and used watch him throughout his Manchester United career. And when I came to London, press operations are part of the the communications team, and our offices are on the same floor as Sebastian Coe, the chairman of 2012, and Paul Dayton, the chief executive. So whenever somebody came into the office, we did get to see quite a number of well-known people.
Yeah.
This one day I was working at my desk and I saw somebody walk past. I just saw the back and I thought, that guy's got a really nice coat on. I didn't think any more of it, carried it. And then I turned around, and when I turned around, David Beckham was standing in front of me, and he said, hello, and I didn't even say hello back. I just stared at him and was in utter shock that David Beckham was so close to me. And he said hello again, and I still didn't say hello. And then he spoke to a few of my colleagues and said hello, and they all just sat there open-mouthed. The fact that David Beckham was in our midst, it was quite an experience. And I've never been like that about any person ever. I'm still very upset at myself that I couldn't even have a conversation with him. I think one of the things that was very different in London, and I know this is different to Sochi because of the Sochi 2014 people have mentioned this a bit. London did not provide any accommodation for volunteers. No. You had to find your own accommodation. And
so were there subsidies for accommodation? Nothing like that.
At all, no.
So you were just you were selected as a volunteer, and that's it. So you knew the day when you had to show up, and how long was one shift? Let's say,
one shift
did
was
people
8
work
hours.
24 hours?
No, 8 hours was. We have quite strict regulations in the UK as to the length of time that you're allowed to work. Okay. But I have to say, one of the issues was not getting volunteers to stay 8 hours. It was to getting them to go at the end of 8 hours. They wanted to stay longer, and we'd have to say, you've been here too long now.
Yeah,
so.
But actually, how was this time, let's say, measured or calculated? Did they have a special card? Did they have to clock in?
No.
So when did they have a log booked, so to register when they showed up and or didn't show up?
What happened is, in advance of the games, I think it was mainly 4 months in advance, each volunteer was given what we call the schedule or the roster, and it told them exactly which days they would be working and what hours they were required for. And then when they came in, their accreditation was read, and so we knew that they were on shift. But they didn't have to do that on the way out, so it was very difficult to control the numbers. But it was great that people wanted to work so much. But when we went around the country actually interviewing, and so when we went to, say, Manchester or Glasgow, we anticipated that people would want to work in Manchester and Glasgow because there were part of the football competition were held in those cities. But everybody I met at the interview said, "Oh no, I want to be in London." And we were saying, "Well, you do realise there's no accommodation." And they were all saying, "Well, we've got a cousin, we've got a friend who we can stay with." So people came to London and stayed in accommodation. When they were working, they were provided with meals, so they were provided.
So how was it organized? How many meals a day could you have? What was this like a canteen where everybody just got in at the time when they had to?
Yeah, there was the workforce catering, which was quite good. And you had when you came in the morning, you were given meal vouchers, and you had to hand in a voucher to have to claim your meal, really, basically. But people were aware of that, but that did not deter them from being part of it. They so much wanted to be part of the games that they gave up. Some people camped literally came down with tents and stayed in fields outside, outside the city, and travelled in every day. They did have transport. Each of them were given what's called an Oyster card, and they were able to use that for the duration of the game. So it didn't cost them anything in terms of transport or meals while on shift, but the accommodation was not provided. I think a really good analogy is of the swan gliding along the water, but frantically
paddling.
Clearly, not everything went well. There were some issues, and I think one of the stories that came out right before the opening ceremony, because the football competition started before the opening ceremony, was South Korea were playing in Glasgow, and when they put the flags up, they actually put the North Korean flag instead of the South Korean, which was very offensive, and that caused a real issue, and the press picked up on that. That was the only time that mistake was made. They absolutely.
But who's in charge of, let's say, the flags flying?
That's protocol.
Protocol.
Are involved
okay.
with that. But I think this might have been an issue in that it was on a scoreboard, so it was an IT type issue that they put the wrong thing into the program, etc.
Okay.
But it was almost a good thing to have happened that early, because that mistake was never made again. It was every flag was double checked, etc. We worked. This might surprise you, but one of the when you signed to say you wanted to work for LOCOG, you had to agree that you would not take a day's holiday from May. So after May we didn't have any days holiday, and in the press area from May onwards we almost worked every single day. We didn't even have a Saturday or a Sunday off. We were in at some point. And during the games, I would get to the office at about 7 a.m. and I would never leave before 1 a.m.
1 a.m.?
Yeah.
So actually...
It's, really long hours. And then I had 4 days off between the Olympics and the Paralympics. I went to see my family. They'd forgotten who I was. And then straight back in. And interestingly, I actually worked harder during the Paralympics because we had fewer staff. And we had fewer volunteers during the Paralympics, and that we had to work really, really hard during the Paralympics.
In Italy, they were saying that not everybody was really for the games in Torino. That area, people of that area supported the games, but not the whole country, because that was like the games for that part of the country. So what was the situation in Great Britain? And what did people think about the Olympic Games taking place in London?
I think very, very similar. We had a group of people who were very negative about the impact of the games. Who said that there would not be a legacy of the games, that it was costing a lot of money, etc. But once the games started, there was no evidence of that. The whole country seemed to get behind it, and were very, very much pro the games and very supportive. I think one of the really interesting issues for us, and again, I'm not sure of what the situation is with Sochi 2014. The torch relay had a massive impact on the country, because that was the one thing that did go to every part of the country. And we had 10 students from Sheffield Hallam University who worked on, they volunteered on the torch relay, so they went everywhere with it, and their stories are inspirational in terms of what they experienced. And what happened was, because it went to little towns and villages, and everybody came out to see the number of people who came out to support the relay was huge. And that was the catalyst, that was the start of everybody the whole country becoming part of the games, without a doubt, And the same thing, we had a Paralympic torch relay as well. Not as long, or as didn't cover as many areas, but by that stage, because the Olympic Games had been such a success, everybody wanted to be involved in the Paralympics, and that made that incredibly successful as well. We wanted to make sure that the Paralympic Games had every much the same profile, the same level of professionalism, expertise, but we were tired by the time that came around. So it was a major effort to actually ensure that we didn't drop our standards in any way, and therefore we lost. Well, we didn't. It was planned that a significant number of staff only worked for the Olympics. We anticipated less media interest, which is the case, but we still had a huge amount. So we had less staff, and yet a high number of competition venues to still cover. So we pushed ourselves quite hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, everybody was assigned to a venue. So the only people who switched venues were people like, if the competition was quite short. So if archery was at the beginning of the games, it was quite short, and they went across to the shooting venue. The whitewater canoeing was short, and then they went across to the mountain bike. So that was the only time that we did that. But basically, we were assigned a venue, and we stayed with that venue. And
Let's say, how many people did you have per one venue? Let's say per stadium. What was the biggest, venue that required the most number of people?
Yeah, it depended on the competition schedule. So, for example, basketball had it was a brutal competition schedule in terms of the number of hours, the number of games, etc. So we had a high number of staff and volunteers at that venue that rotated. As you would imagine, the athletic stadium had a high number of staff, but some of the other venues were smaller, so we determined our staff numbers on the competition schedule.
How many people are we talking about, let's say, per basketball venue or the central stadium?
Yeah, we would have had, basketball, if I remember, we would have had about, probably about 12 to 14 paid staff, and then something like 90 or so volunteers. 90, yeah, just for press operations. Just for press operations.
Plus the language service.
Plus language services, plus protocol, and then event services as well. The areas that were the largest in London were event services were huge. They're the people who do spectator services, showing people to seats, etc. So they were the biggest number of staff and volunteers. Then medical services were very big as well, and then press operations is the third largest functional area.
Medical services.
Medical
I didn't
service
know that.
Very high.
In terms of volunteers as well.
Yeah. So again, we have quite strict regulations in terms of having first aid, medical people, so many in a venue per spectator numbers, that sort of thing. We had to match that. The reality is that we over sort of scoped in many venues in order to overcome those issues. So there was never an occasion where we were dramatically short of volunteers. If that was the case, paid staff stepped into to those roles. So just to give you an example, one night they did have an issue in the stadium, and so we were given a call at the main press centre, and I was called into the stadium that night, and I worked for the photography team that evening. So we had a core team of paid staff who did step into roles if necessary. But overall, we did incredibly well in terms of getting the numbers right.
How much time do you think should be really necessary to train one volunteer for your function? So can they learn as they go? I mean, for both paid staff or volunteers. So what do you think about how many hours, let's say, or how much time in general should be allocated?
The London training programme was intensive. I mentioned before I worked in Athens, and I worked. I didn't have any training for either of the roles that I did at the other games, but for this role we decided to do an intensive training, because one of the things we wanted to do is this would be part of the legacy, that we were training people to work as volunteers in other events, that sort of thing. I think there is a need for a level of training without a doubt, but absolutely, you really do learn on the job. Once you're in there, that's when you actually learn, how to deal with an irate journalist who can't find their laptop. We had examples of journalists who would come to us and say, "I've left my laptop in Wimbledon, and I need to be in the stadium tonight." so
can I get my laptop?
Can somebody get my laptop? Okay. And so we had laptops that we could loan, that sort of thing. But we had photographers who would drop their lens. I mean, the lenses are very, very expensive. And so we had Canon and Nikon on site to do they did a camera loan and repair service for us. So we had training to allow people to know that was available to them was quite important. So I think that a level of training is important, but actually learning in the role is probably the reality, that you learn more when you're involved in the situation. And basically, it means a release from the job that your full-time job. So my full-time role is within Sheffield Hallam University, but I have experience of working on events, and I have always tried to keep current and up to date in terms of my knowledge, because it assists my teaching without a doubt. So I'd been involved in events, and I was approached to ask if I wanted to go to work for the organising committee. Now, to do that, I would have to resign from my job, and at the end of 2012, I would have no job. And as you can imagine, that wouldn't appeal to a lot of people, but as a secondment...
Yeah, because a lot of people that work as paid staff for social organizing committee do not really know what they're going to do after the Olympic Games are over. No. So they have to think twice to join the organizing committee or not. So.
And that's the majority of people that I worked with at London 2012 are now travelling around the world on holiday. They don't have jobs to go to, and a lot of them are looking for. They're on holiday currently over the Christmas period, and then they'll all be looking for jobs. So for me, this was an opportunity, and basically, the university agreed to release me for 2 years. They continue to pay my salary and my pension and all that sort of thing. So for me, I still get the same salary, etc. It doesn't change. London 2012 made a contribution towards my salary to the university. Not the full amount, but a contribution towards it. And then the university agreed to that because for them it was... they had a lot of opportunity to promote the fact that they were involved directly with London 2012. We had students who came to volunteer as a result of that. And for that, when we were trying to sell positions on the course, then that works well for the university. They like the option to do that. So that a secondment basically is a release for a certain period, and the organising committee pay a contribution towards that member of staff. I would definitely recommend the use of the test events to try out as many activities as possible. We, press operations in London, were involved in every single one of the test events. We needed to be, because the media were very interested in everything, and the learning curve that we went through was enormous. There's nothing quite like being in the venue that the event will take place in, with some of the people there, in order to recognise what you need to develop further, what doesn't work so well, what you can improve upon, things that you absolutely need to avoid happening ever again. The test events were invaluable for that, without a doubt. I came to Sochi in November, end of October, beginning of November last year. It was my first visit to Russia. I spent 4 days in Moscow, so I was a tourist in Moscow. I went to the Kremlin and St. Basil's Cathedral, and I thoroughly enjoyed my visit, and then came to Sochi State University to the conference there, which was again an incredibly enjoyable experience. I found the people incredibly welcoming and very friendly, and to see Sochi and experience where the next games will be happening was very exciting. And while I was there, I took the opportunity to meet some people from the Sochi 2014 organising committee, and hopefully, I'll be coming to Sochi again next year. We have some plans to do that, and my fingers crossed. I'll be able to be involved in the games in 2014 as well. That's my desire, really. Yeah.
And all the best from me and Rozmari. So see you soon.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye, everyone. Thank you.